Hello, it's 1 o'clock, Wednesday, the 17th of May, which means it's time for our Fresh Insights webinar today with our guest speaker, John Boys from CIPD. So welcome everyone. Judging from the registrations, of which there were about 170 people who wanted to join this event today, I've either met you at an event in person or seen you before at another webinar, so I'm delighted to welcome a lot of familiar faces. There's also quite a few newcomers. So for the benefit of those people, my name's Dan Hawes, and I'm the co-founder of GRB, which stands for Graduate Recruitment Bureau, which was set up in 1997 to become the go-to platform for high caliber university students, graduates, alumni and employers. We're based in Brighton, got 75 staff, and we have over 2,000 clients, all sectors, big companies, small companies, some very well-known organizations that are along today. And in that time, we've successfully matched over 8,000 graduates into full-time graduate or executive level roles. This is what the GRB group now looks like after we've been going for 25 years. So Graduate Recruitment Bureau supply graduates to organisations all over the UK. We've got various different industry teams, either providing contingency or volume recruitment or advertising services. We also have two experienced hire divisions, Cortex and Metrica. So if you're ever looking for IT or numerate graduates up to 5 years experience, those two divisions can supply those candidates. And in the last few years, we launched Graduate Mentor, a way to provide a support system for students and graduates from diverse, disadvantaged and marginalized backgrounds to receive one-to-one mentoring. So if you're interested in mentoring, do drop me a line. We'd love to have you involved in that initiative. Okay, so GRN, we've come a long way. We set up in January 2009, initially for our clients and some of our friends in the industry. It's quite a small world. But we've been able to increase membership in that time to around 3,550 members. In the last couple of months, we've had over 100 new members join us. So a big welcome to some of our new members who are joining us today. But generally, we try and bring together HR advisors, early talent acquisition, recruitment managers, directors, that kind of level into the group so we can talk about various topics and issues that we find challenging. So by sharing this best practice, ultimately, we're helping you become even better graduate recruiters. The membership is varied. So, we have FTSE 100, Fortune 500 firms, the big recognizable graduate recruiters, but also a huge number of organizations that are in the hidden job market, I suppose. Graduates may not be as aware of them. But they're still interested in early talent. So we have a number of members who are from very fast growing firms across all sectors, mostly in the UK, with some members from other parts of the world. So that's a quick overview of where we're at with GRN as of today. Now, who's in the room? So I mentioned the kind of companies we have as members. So today we have organizations such as Google, Britvic, M&S, RSM, NHS, to name but a few, but you all share one thing in common. You're interested in early talent. So you're either a manager involved with talent acquisition, recruitment, development, or careers, or in an advisory role. So that's just a word cloud of some of your job titles I always throw in there, just so you can see who's in the room today. So after my intro, we're going to hand over to John Boys, senior labour market economist at CIPD. We'll then have the opportunity for questions. Now, everyone had the opportunity to provide questions before the event, which John and I have gone through. There's some crossover with those questions, so we will cover as many as possible. But with over 100 questions, we're not unfortunately going to be able to answer all of them, but we will do our best to help you. We aim to finish by 2. And by the way, this is all being recorded, so if you do have to duck out or you'd like to share it with a colleague, I will be sharing the recorded version shortly after. Okay, so John Boys, This is the second time John has been involved with the GRN. He actually came along to one of our leaders' lunches in London, I think it was last year, where we had a room full of members and we were finding out about his insights at that particular point in time. So it's lovely to see you face to face, John. And since then, I often see your comments or articles or LinkedIn posts talking about the labour market. In fact, on Saturday, you were on the front page of the FT. You commented on how organisations are not sure about whether they are allowed to send emails during the weekend out of office hour, and how this kind of work-life balance is blurring a little bit. So that's an entirely different subject, but it just shows the scope of things that John is heavily involved in. So regularly featured in a lot of the broadsheets, and obviously at CIPD. A lot of our members are also CIPD members, so you may have met him in person as well. So if you don't know, he's primarily a quantitative analyst and researcher, and currently leads economic policy at CIPD, working mainly with survey data to garner insights on the world of work. So we are also going to continue the conversation on our LinkedIn group. We always do this to enable members to ask any questions of our speaker for about 24 hours after the event. So we're delighted that John will be available for 24 hours to answer any other questions you may have. So go over to the LinkedIn group after our presentation. So I'd like to hand over to John and enable him to share his insights from the labour market and how it affects you as early talent recruiters. John, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Dan. You're actually the fourth person to have to have noticed that I was quoted on the front page of the FT. Must notice when it's the front page, so that's always nice.
Exactly.
It was in response to the Labour Party. They're thinking about sort of banning the boss from contacting you after hours, and
Yeah.
I found some good data from the Labour Force survey looking at who actually is bothered out of hours, and it turns out it's the sort of highest skilled, most highest paid sort of people. So it's one of the trade-offs that they make. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the labour market. We're going to try and make this interesting. Okay, so it's been tailored to you, and I've sort of looked at the questions that have been asked, and I hope to answer a few of them. So to start, I'm going to draw some charts. This is what I like to do with presentations, draw some charts from the Monetary Policy Report, which came out last Thursday to accompany the Bank of England's interest rate decision. So they raised interest rates. The reason I really like this report is because it's free. It's there to help policymakers. It means you don't have to spend lots of money on a sort of private macroeconomic forecast or anything like that. Anyone can dip into these reports, and they're really useful for some of the headline things happening in the economy, such as GDP, inflation, and unemployment. So they're the three main charts that I'm going to look at. Okay, to start, we've got GDP. This is growth. This is the big one. You have to ignore the first part of this chart. That's the past data. So if we look on the left-hand side, this is what happens when you switch an economy off and back on again. You get a big dip in GDP and then a big recovery. But the standout point from this chart is that the UK has avoided a recession, but only technically. You'll see that going forward to 2023, 24, 25, 26, we're hovering at zero. We've got growth of roughly nothing. And that's quite miserable, really, because growth is, some people say GDP is not too important, but it's sort of associated with a lot of good outcomes, life expectancy, having money to spend on public services, that sort of thing. So yeah, we're looking at a period of almost zero growth. The next slide looks at unemployment. Now, someone asked the question, is unemployment rate forecasted to be higher in the next 2 years? The answer is kind of no, I'd say. So unemployment's about 3.9%. This is a fan chart that the Bank of England use. It's quite clever. They say the darkest part is where they think it's likely to be, but it could be either side of the range. But essentially, they're saying that by 2026, unemployment will rise from about 3.9% to 4.5%. So unemployment is expected to rise, but that's a very modest rise. If we look at the past, you can see there's a bump during COVID. It didn't rise very much because of the furlough scheme that really protected people from unemployment. But if this chart had actually gone back further to say 2012, you would have seen unemployment up at sort of 8-9%. It would have come down. So we're at an area I'd say most economists would agree is kind of full employment. It's really they're really unemployment really couldn't get much lower, and even though it's going to rise, it's going to be modest. Uh, Now, the implication for your work is that there are just not many candidates around. So we're going to think about this in terms of supply and demand. So unemployment is people who are out of work and they're looking for work. They're looking and available for work. And by the way, that happens to be the largest rates of unemployment happen to be at younger ages. It's that transition from education into employment. Um, Another problem is that the number of people in employment is actually lower still than the post-pandemic peak. You can imagine this chart here of people in employment carrying on if we hadn't had the pandemic, but it's actually smaller. So this is the kind of great resignation, the great retirement. It's generally driven by older people. A lot of it is just purely driven by demography, actually. So I've been working with some clerks at the House of Lords and also talking to people at Bank of England about the effect of demography, and we think that it explains about half of the increase in inactivity, extra inactivity. But the key takeaway from both these charts, from unemployment and from employment, is that the supply of candidates is restricted, and that sort of trade-off between supply and demand, because demand is still very hot, means that it's difficult to recruit. So now a very important chart is inflation. If we look at the past data, not the projection, we can see that it's peaked. It's on the way down, but it's at an incredibly high level. So someone asked, is graduate pay keeping up with inflation? The answer is probably no, because very few people's pay is keeping up with inflation at the moment. If your graduate pay intake has gone up 10% this year, if it's gone from £25,000 to £27,500, then yes, but the chances are it's not. I think the interesting thing about this chart is that the way inflation is calculated, I actually think is mathematically a bit tricky, because it's the increase in prices on the year before. So what happens is after a year, the price level is up, but then if it doesn't rise any further, you've still got higher prices, but inflation will start to come down. So if inflation goes from its current high of about 10% and it comes down, say, to 5%, all that means is that prices are still rising, but they're rising by 5%. So the cumulative effect of this high inflation will be a much higher price level. So essentially, the cost of living crisis is sort of set to continue. Um, that's not good news. The government has got a target of reducing inflation by half. It's a peculiar thing to say, really, because the government's not really responsible for inflation. That's the Bank of England. They're the one that can raise rates to try and dampen demand and try and bring inflation down. But also, just the maths of it is that it will drop out the bottom and naturally come down. So they're sort of trying to claim credit for something that's very likely to happen anyway. So these are the big macro charts. They're not my charts. They're from the Bank of England, but I like to rely on them. Now I'm going to talk about some of my charts. So this is from our labour market outlook, which came out on Monday. This is a survey of 2,000 employers, HR, senior HR people, and it sort of asks, what are your recruitment and redundancy, hiring and firing sort of intentions for the coming quarter, so up to the end of June. And so this is our way of trying to get a bit of an edge on what's happening in the future. Our first chart it's called the net employment balance, and it's the difference between those who plan to recruit staff and those who plan to have their staff numbers go down. So if the number is positive, it means more people are planning to recruit staff, or more people are planning to expand the size of their workforce. And the answer is that it's positive across all the big sort of sectors, public, private, voluntary in total. But we can see that it's softening a bit. Uh, things were definitely red hot on the sort of pandemic reopening. They remain pretty hot, but things are a little bit softer than they were. If we look at that by different industry, the real lesson is that across the board, it's positive. But it might be slightly interesting to see that places like construction, hospitality, and healthcare are particularly hot on the net employment balance. Our next chart looks at, we're just breaking the balance down now into recruitment and into redundancy. So again, across the board, relatively high levels of hiring happening. These time series charts are quite nice because you can see the effect of the pandemic very clearly, and then the recovery. But I'd say it's pretty stable on recruitment, particularly if we look at the sort of total number. It's quite a stable figure. I just wanted to quickly put this chart of vacancies again, just to make the point that demand for staff is very high. So we were looking at this chart on recruitment. This is a similar chart. I think what's interesting with vacancy data from the ONS is that because recruitment, it takes a bit of time to recruit someone. Vacancy data is forward looking. It does give you an idea of what people plan to do in the future. The really obvious story here is that it dropped on the pandemic, it recovered, but it blew through the ceiling. And even though it's softening, it's clearly coming down, but it's way above the pre-pandemic level. So there are lots of vacancies, there's strong demand for staff. Onto redundancies. Now, someone asked, are we seeing more companies making redundancies? Realistically, according to this chart, not really. It's been trending down for a while. It's clearly trending up, but it's sort of way below the general pre-pandemic level. So I think we're sort of seeing a turnaround in redundancies, but employers generally, they don't like to make redundancies. There's ways that you can, this might not be the best leading indicator. In fact, things like unemployment as well, they're terrible leading indicators of where the economy is going, because it's usually after a recession hits that they go up. You can imagine that if you want to reduce your staff levels because there's less demand, making redundancies is quite a strong place to start. You might go for a hiring freeze, natural churn as well. As people retire and move jobs, you might not replace them. So I'm sort of not surprised that there's not a particularly noticeable increase in redundancies, although it is very slowly trending up from quite a low base. So the next chart, we ask a question, have you got hard to fill vacancies? 42% of employers do, but 41% don't have vacancies at all. So of those that do, that's quite a high proportion. And when we ask, do you expect to still have hard to fill vacancies in the next 6 months? Well, it's about, quick maths here, 62%. So the majority say, yeah, we anticipate problems, significant problems, 26%, minor problems, 36%. So this is kind of saying that, a reasonable number of employers are having a tough time recruiting roles, and they also expect that to continue into the future. This is quite interesting when we break it down by sector. Education and healthcare come top. These are, of course, sectors that are public sector, generally public sector. The pay has not been rising as fast as in the private sector. So we got new stats on Tuesday that showed that regular pay in the public sector was growing about 5.6%, but more like 7% in the private sector. And there are also sectors with quite a bit of industrial action at the moment. So no surprises there. But I won't talk to everything in these charts, but you'll all be welcome to have the slides afterwards, and you might be able to pick out some things that relate more to your own industries. So what's interesting is we ask employers what they plan to do in response to hard to fill vacancies. And the number one thing is to upskill more existing staff. It's interesting that number 3 is to increase the duties of existing staff. So I think that's sort of employers' ways of saying, in response to difficulty hiring, we're going to try and get more out of our existing staff. which may have implications down the line for sort of work intensity and things like that. But there's a host of other things that are quite interesting, but quite a long tail. Raising wages is, of course, in second position. Now I'm going to look at pay. So we ask about pay expectations for sort of pay awards, and our time series goes back to 2012. It's the highest it's ever been for all of these sectors: public, private, voluntary, and overall. This month it rose to 3.3 for public. That's a little bit lower than other stats. So I cited earlier 5.6% pay growth in the public sector. The reason it's different is because this is just the sort of base uplift that people are expecting. But in the general economy, people, they move jobs, they get promotions, and so pay growth in general was a bit higher than this metric. But this is really telling you that things are red hot, because these are the highest numbers that we've seen so far. But interesting, the gap between these two, again, even if the gap narrows between public and private, as long as it exists, cumulatively the absolute difference in pay between those two sectors will get larger, and I can imagine that you'll get more problems trying to recruit and retain in sectors that can't sort of pay more, so public sector. And I also just wanted to supplement this with some ONS data, which I've looked at by industry, and this was average weekly earnings growth in the year to March 2023. Just to make the point that I'm not 100% sure what's happened in real estate activities, but certainly in all these other sectors, it's very positive, and in some it's particularly positive. So professional, scientific, and technical activities, which actually that sector covers most sort of professional occupations, but certainly in IT as well. These are actually numbers that exceed inflation. So there are some people who are just about staying ahead, but they don't exceed it by very much. In fact, I don't know, but in March 2023, inflation, I think, was about 10.5. So it's only one group that just about managed to keep up, and they may not be keeping up indefinitely. So I've got some charts now, which they're slightly unrelated to this kind of economic forecasting, but I hope that they're really interesting to the sort of work that you do. So the first ones I've got working from home. Now, I shared these charts with people in the GRN before, but I've added a year of data since. So there's some really interesting trends. These charts look at working from home by occupation. What's interesting is that managers, professionals, and associate professionals, they're way up top. And the specific question asked, this is from the labour force survey, is where is your main place of work? And I used people who said my own home. So if you worked from home 3 out of 5 days, you would probably answer home to this. If you worked in the office 3 days, you'd probably say somewhere separate. So this chart really underestimates hybrid, but it's nice to have a kind of consistent data over time. So this is about, it's getting close to sort of 50 data sets, all with 40 to 80,000 respondents. It's a very robust sample. It allows us to cut it by different variables. But what's interesting is that the three occupations at the top, managers, professionals, associate professionals, we often use them as a sort of proxy for graduate level jobs. And I do actually have this chart broken down by qualification level as well. So we'll move on to that soon. What I think is one of the most interesting charts that I really think is going to be useful for your work is cutting it by age. And the story here is very interesting. Essentially, pre-pandemic, the top two lines are 60 to 64 and 65 to 69. So the oldest age groups had the highest rates of home working. Post-pandemic, and it's basically between 30 and 50, the middle age groups that are right at the top. But what's most interesting here, I think, is that the 20 to 24-year-olds have started going back into the office. Sorry, I think I've just got to cough. And that's not something I've seen written about. So there's a chance actually that you know more about why this is than me. I suspect it might be to do, someone asked, how are employers presenting hybrid and flexible working practices in vacancies and onboarding? I suspect there's something to do with the difficulty of onboarding and training and the sort of social side of work that the 20 to 24-year-olds were not getting in the office. But now I have a good 4 or 5 quarters showing a consistent sort of drop in the rates of homeworking at 20 to 24. So I think that's a real story, but it sort of does show that there's different preferences across the age group. And finally, I promised you this chart, which is working from home by qualification level. There's a pretty linear relationship. Degree or equivalent is right at the top, followed by higher education, followed by A levels, GCSEs, with sort of no qualification at the bottom. So that is interesting if you're in the area of sort of grad recruitment. I'm not quite sure what it means with the how you tally that with the 2024s going back in, but what's clear to me is that none of these numbers have settled. Pre-pandemic, we've got pretty flat lines, but these are still moving around a lot, which is why I regularly add a new quarters of data just to see, how far things have moved. And finally, just to look by region, because I know that people quite like to look by region. The takeaway for me from this is that London was not even the homeworking capital pre-pandemic. It was the southeast, but now it's sort of shot to the top. There's some big differences by region, but I think they actually more reflect the type of jobs that people do. So they more reflect the professions and things. And again, I sort of put these charts in for your own perusal in your own time. I'm just picking out the headlines. We did also make a map to look at. The geographical distribution, and it's all around the major conurbations, and you can even see the sort of M3 and the M4, which is quite interesting. So now I've got a couple of charts now coming up, which are I'd say they're kind of wild card charts. So we'll start with a chart on housing, because I think this is probably becoming more and more of an issue with younger people, and particularly grads. So I've got a chart showing the tenure that people have, and it changed over 20 years by age. And the blue is owned outright, green is being bought with a mortgage, and yellow is rented. So this is in the UK. And you can see there's been a massive increase in the proportion of young people just in 20 years. The proportion of young people who are renting, far fewer owning. And, interestingly, renting does mean that you can be a little bit more mobile. You can move about a bit more. But obviously, you're locked out of sort of building housing wealth. Now, someone asked a specific question, which are grads being put off of London? So I've done the same chart, but in London with absolute numbers. And the fascinating thing is the three bottom lines, 20 to 30, basically, both get smaller between 2002 and 2022. So the young population of London has actually decreased in the last 20 years, whilst the older age groups have all got bigger. And I wonder if there's something in there about sort of the cost of living, and I don't mean the most recent cost of living. I mean the sort of the cost of getting into London and setting up there is just too high, and it's kind of putting off these younger groups from being there. I've now got some charts looking at demography. I said earlier, I think demography is quite big. And these are just charts that I think they're not particularly well known, but I think they're quite interesting to grad recruiters. So this chart here looks at the ethnic breakdown by different age groups. And the takeaway really is that diversity increases as you get younger, to the point where I think population wise, maybe 13% are of people in the UK are an ethnic minority, but it's more like 25% for under 16, and it's getting near to 20% for the sort of graduate age. So in thinking about sort of diversity initiatives, what I mean with this chart is to say that it's not popular among young people. Young people are diversity. It's just a much more diverse cohort. And I know that forms an important strand. I've only looked at one dimension of diversity here. But if we looked at other dimensions as well, if we look at things like social mobility or LGBTQ plus, that sort of thing, well, we'll find probably more diversity at younger ages. I do have those charts somewhere. The next chart in demography, I wanted to just show you, this is simply the population of the UK from 0 to 104 in 2023. And what's quite fascinating is that you've got these kind of echoes in the birth rate. So there's a peak of people around age 58, and they're probably going to head into retirement quite soon. And the reason I know that is because I have a chart showing the age economic activity by age 50 to 64. And by the age 64, actually more than half of people have already exited work. So if I go back to this chart, if there's a big lump of people here, the chances are in the next 5 to 10 years, they're going to move out of work. Final section is just a quick chart on sickness. This is something that is getting more and more attention every day. More research is showing that the UK population just appears to just be sicker than it was. So I've got a chart on sickness absence. This is had days off because sick or injured. It's spiky because it's seasonal. But the story is that it was trending down when COVID was happening, right down when COVID happened, which might seem counterintuitive, but a lot of people on furlough, a lot of people working from home. But the base level that it's settled at now is higher than it was pre-pandemic. So there's more sickness and more sickness absence. Now, I've got a couple more slides now, which I actually only just put in the last half hour because there were some questions about young people and retention. And I thought it was really interesting and important to make this point about retention and turnover. So I've used official data from the ONS to look at turnover by age group. And this is the proportion with, in grey, a different employer. The purple is not working in year 2, so that could be retired, it could be a student, and then the sort of teal color is with the same employer. And the point I wanted to make is that sometimes young people are seen as a sort of more transigent workforce, but actually someone in sort of younger ages between 16 and 24, they're very similar to someone over the age of 60. And that's because such a high proportion of people over the age of 60 will leave work entirely to either an inactive category or to retirement. And so you end up with quite an interesting chart, which suggests that if someone said, well, you'll get more years out of someone who's older, that's not necessarily true, because a lot of their tenure, which is longer, is in the past. So what I have done is I've broken down age on the vertical axis here from younger to older groups by their length of service. And it's a very interesting chart because the younger age groups have got much lower tenure. Part of the reason they've only been there less than 3 months, 3 to 6 months, is because simply they are younger. So they haven't had time to accrue. You know, someone 16 to 17 will not have had time to accrue this bar up here, this 20 years or more. But the important point to make is that I don't think that younger people are more jumpy. I don't think they jump around jobs. They're this chart would look the same if we made it in the 50s. It's younger people, just whether they're Gen Z or they're baby boomers, they just do move around jobs a bit more, and we should probably think of that as a good thing. It's just the economy's way of putting them in the right place, and you know, finding their feet. So that actually concludes my talk. Apologies, because I think at one point I actually swallowed a fly, and that's why I was coughing. It was only a small fly, but it wasn't pleasant. But I managed to power through. So thanks very much, and you know, always happy to take questions, and certainly happy to have a follow on LinkedIn and Twitter and that sort of thing.
Well done. There's a nursery rhyme about swallowing a fly, isn't there? I won't go into that.
Hope I'll be okay.
John, thank you very much for your overview. And it, is fresh data. 2 days ago, you launched this survey. So, that's why we like having these webinars entitled Fresh Insights, because it gives our members access to more than just the headlines, because a lot of these headlines are misleading. But to have the data presented in such a way that you've done makes it easy to digest. So thank you, John. I knew it'd be good. And of course, we will share the slides to our members. Now, we did have so many questions, and you kind of cleverly weaved the answers to those, some of those in the presentation. So particularly one member was wondering how the cost of living crisis is affecting graduates' career plans. Well, you illustrated that with the number of people renting in London, not being able to own a home. That's a big cost of living. And I'm sure that's replicated across the UK with those decisions, being affected by, what they've got in their pockets. And, owning a property is becoming less and less a reality for young graduates. So hopefully that's answered your question there, Lowry Bell from Smart Currency Exchange. Did you have any other questions, John, that you saw that you could answer as well? Scan through, yeah.
Well, I was looking through and I was thinking about how I quite like these sessions because I don't always know the answers, but sometimes
Yeah.
you get some good sort of anecdotal insights from people in the field, which it's grand. Me, I've got access to quite large data sets and I can sort of torture them until they give me nice charts. But some of them, I thought, well, I wouldn't necessarily be able to answer if I didn't have the experience of doing it. But it seems that people are curious to know what other companies are doing, aren't they, and what
Oh
other
yes.
firms are doing.
Yeah.
And that's sometimes a bit of a blind spot in some. That's kind of why we do the labour market outlook survey, actually.
Yeah.
And now that we've just launched the report on Monday, we'll be starting to go with the second one, and we'll have to think about ideas. So sometimes we think we don't have a good angle on what employers are doing. Let's ask a question about it in the upcoming one.
Mm.
I'm just looking through some of the. I mean, I think what's also difficult is sometimes there's a bit of a lag in the data that's available to me. So, for example,
Right.
the home working charts, you'll
Mm.
notice that they end in December. So
Yeah.
there's been another 6 months that I'm sure some interesting things have happened. The trends have developed as well. Um, I was quite interested in the questions about AI and generative AI and what can we do
Okay.
about that.
Yeah.
We've had quite a big conversation internally and publicly at the CIPD about ChatGPT
Okay.
and how it can be used. Um, I think we've kind of come to the conclusion that it's here,
Yeah.
and certainly internally we're kind of encouraged to at least play with it,
Mm.
even if we don't use it to in our work. Now, in response to the idea that what do you do to make recruitment channels GPT proof?
Yeah.
I'm not sure you can. I think that part of the skill of the new labour market and new jobs will be using this technology correctly. And if someone's able to write an application, really you want your application process to test for the skills that are going to be used in the job.
Yeah.
And the chances are that if ChatGPT allows someone to write a good application, then the chances are it will allow them to write good work in their role if that's what they need to do. So um, I think that there are varying levels of risk around this, but
Mm.
that's one area that I'm particularly excited about. Only because I've been using it in my own work. So some of the charts you see, I'll occasionally have a bug in the code. I'll ask ChatGPT, and it'll come up with a solution. I think that's fantastic. So the gifts of the housing tenure, I had a problem trying to size it, and
Right.
ChatGPT gave me the answer. Things like that. So I suspect that a new skill of the new cohort of people coming in will be how do you leverage that technology effectively, and I would be less sort of worried about it being used um, in a sort of in bad ways, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
um, but
Yeah.
I'll
It's
continue to.
yeah. It's causing a lot of concern, understandably, for early talent recruiters and how they can either use it or identify if it's being used by applicants, among other things. So yeah, an entirely another topic for a webinar, which we will try and cover. Yeah, there were a few questions about ChatGPT and AI and machine learning, but in regards to um, the labour market, I mean the demography stats that's been around for some time. We know there are fewer youngsters in existence in the UK, and it's making it harder for recruiters to recruit students and graduates from an ever decreasing pool of individuals. So that hasn't gone away. What is interesting is your slide that showed what your members, presumably CIPD members, are doing to address these issues where they're unable to find or fill hard to fill roles. So could you go back to that by any chance? Because one of the top things was getting existing or retraining existing staff or getting them to do the jobs of someone that they can't find, spreading it around. Wasn't That's quite interesting, and an obvious first step for an employer that's really up against it, but's not without its with its dangers over the long term, and expecting more from less from their there it is, yeah. So upskilling existing staff. We do hear about a lot of members maybe recruiting internally as well, so that may be included in that category. Raising wages to retain people, increasing the duties of existing staff, improving job quality, hiring more apprentices, making an effort to recruit older workers, and then hire more UK graduates, which is interesting. That says past 6 months was 17%, but 24% projected in the future, if that's correct.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's
Yeah.
a bit more emphasis, isn't there, on some of these early careers routes, hiring more apprenticeships and hiring more graduates, and
Yeah.
perhaps this. I mean, we have put there is make an effort to recruit older workers, but perhaps that group is seen as increasingly difficult, as that's the sort of cohort that have been
Yeah.
increasing their inactivity and leaving this sort of great resignation sort of thing. I think that. I do have so I know that we say that in absolute terms the number of young people, maybe there's more, maybe there's less, but what's happened is that the employment rates of young people have got really low. So I looked recently and I worked out that if you had the same employment rates of young people 16 to 24
Yeah.
today as you had 30 years ago, you would have an extra 1 million people in the workforce, and
Right.
that's purely as a result of well, people staying in education longer and taking longer to transition into work. So I just wonder if I can find that chart in real time.
Yeah.
But it's a fascinating insight, because if you recruit specifically from a sector that has uh, if you're a sector that's particularly reliant on younger people.
Yeah.
So we've done a report on older workers, but actually it looked at all ages. And when we looked at the average age of different industries, it was about 34 in hospitality, but 46 in agriculture, farming and things like that. So the problem is, if you have historically relied on that sort of cohort of people, the younger people, and there's less and less of them, then you have to start thinking about other channels and other ways of doing it. Or if many places, of course, have not always relied on graduates, but now there are jobs that are kind of considered graduate level jobs, or at least you can get a graduate for them because it's such a popular route into the labor market. And I'm not always convinced that it comes with sort of the requisite employability, because one of the trade-offs of having spent so much time in the labor market is that people have not been in work, which is
Yeah.
a place where you do gather skills,
Yeah.
skills that you learn and are able to utilize in work that are useful. So I do have economic activity over time. uh no, might be slightly tricky for me to do it in real time. So
Okay.
what I'll do is
Okay.
I'll
Well.
affix it to the slides, and then when we share them, we can make that point. But there's a
Oh,
million less young people. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. That's very kind. Thank you. And presumably, if people want more granular information, do they have to be a CIPD member to get this, or can you share some of it? Or
Um, what I would say is it helps.
yes,
So,
of course.
uh,
Okay.
like if
Well.
I'm not, yeah, I always
Yeah.
try and help. If I can do something and it's a quick job, I
Yeah.
absolutely will do it.
Okay. Thank you.
But if it's a slightly larger job, I'd probably bend over backwards a little
Yeah.
bit more for a member. Yeah.
Appreciate that. I mean, a lot of our members are CIPD members as well, so they may be interested to find out a little bit more, because there is so much devil's in the detail, as they say, and there's so many things I noticed in those slides that resonates with me, and our clients. So, for instance, how graduates are more keen to work in the office generally. They're being trained up. They need to sit next to their colleagues and build social capital within their new employer. And it's a friend network. We've heard of this before. So that is a thing for most roles, at least. Yeah, I mean, we had so many questions about generally about recruitment and any of the sort of the changes that you're foreseeing. Some also from an international angle, which we are a bit limited in sharing with you. But you did answer most of those questions in your presentation. By the way, do feel free to put any other questions you want into the chat, and we'll do our best to cover those. I'm going to look for if you could share your slides once more, John, please.
Sure.
Let's have a look. Yes, what was the next one before that?
Oh, the hard to fill vacancies by industry.
Yes, right. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, very industry specific. I mean, hard to fill. Are you defining that as not being able to find the skill set, or is your location holding you back, or the perception of your industry, or is it all of those?
Yeah, I mean,
What's your
we've not
definition? Yeah.
not really gone into much more detail. We've sort of said if you've got vacancies, have you got hard to fill vacancies? Occasionally we ask, are they skills based or labor based, and can you just not get the bodies, getting the people to apply, or is it around specific skills? I would say some of the feedback we've got on this question is people will come to me and say things like, oh, do you know about specific occupations? And I sort of say, no, that is a bit of a weak spot. I would like to know more. But I think the problem is when you've got only a sample of 2,000, it sounds like quite a lot, but it's not. So if you look at, for example, one of my home working charts, just one of those quarters is a sample of 80,000 people, which means
Right.
that I can sort of cut it up. So the 2,000 sample is brilliant, but only for the top level trends. What's likely to happen to recruitment, redundancy, and then you can cut it by industry, but that's about the limit of it. We're given the sample. It's kind of tricky to get a bigger sample. So
Sure, sure,
um,
sure.
yeah, I'd like to know more. I think it's on my to-do list to try and get a bit behind that stat.
And also, I mean, being in the position that you are and having all this data at your fingertips, aside from that, what are you hearing anecdotally from your members, or people within your network that might not be contained within this data and this presentation?
I
What are you
think the
hearing?
I think the feeling is that there's always a sense that there's a crisis. It's
Right.
a perma crisis. So you have the Brexit vote in 2016, and then you had obviously COVID and furlough, and these were quite large disruptions. They turned everything on its head.
Mm,
But I think at the moment we're looking at a period of relative stability, actually.
right.
Some of these charts, particularly the first ones, where we look at, I mean, as miserable as zero growth is, it is a
Mm,
constant.
yeah.
And like I say, if this time series was bigger, you'd see unemployment all over the place. But this is almost a flat line for the next
Yeah.
3 or 4 years. So we're looking at a
Yeah.
period of relative stability. Nothing is moving fast. If I
No.
look at something like vacancies, these are big drops. These are things that the adjustment process here was just awful, the supply shortages in certain sectors and that sort of thing. So I think that what I'm hearing is that there's like a relative degree of instability, even
Right.
if there's not quite a healthy equilibrium.
Mm,
And what's particularly interesting is that in regards to the cost of living crisis, um, all firms are exposed to it. So to an extent that shields you. If you can't offer a high pay to match inflation, well, no one else can as well. You're sort of your ability to do that, everyone's kind of in the same boat to an extent. So that's why across the board we're seeing real terms pay cuts. But yeah, I'd say on Tuesday morning, I had to write a response to the labour market statistics that come out at 7 o'clock.
Yeah.
And, I really struggled to come up with something because they looked almost identical to the release that came out the month before. And that in itself, I think, is a story that we're looking at a period of relative stability. Um, it might be a different case if the workforce, if we hadn't lost so many people, if this chart here didn't look like this. If there were
Yeah.
more people, we might not be having these problems. But I think essentially it's quite a challenging recruitment and retention market at the moment. And a big part of that is just the hit to the workforce. There's the fewer people there. Um, and that's also why I sort of included the sickness chart at the end. I didn't talk to it much, but I think that there's a few trends that I see coming. I see demography having a bigger role to play, and I see just sickness in the economy as being like something that's more problematic, and we'll be talking about more. But yeah, I'd say my feeling from talking to people is that sort of a relative stability is
Well,
is the name of the game at the moment.
well, that's good news because we all we hear is everything's so uncertain. We're on a roller coaster. We've got absolutely no control over anything. But to hear you say we are entering a period of relative stability, you know, not exciting growth, which we'd want, but that kind of gives us a lot of comfort. People might be able to plan, not expand as much as they can, but kind of gather themselves and move forward in the next few years. And as a country, I know as part of the G7, we're punching below our weight. There's so much potential within this country, and I'm not sure if you are, aware of what the government is trying to do to drive this forward. Because although we've avoided a recession, is there, um, you know, global economic forces at play that might affect us?
Well, so I think one of the interesting things and the job for people who are sort of trying to manage a talent pipeline is to see past some of the noise,
Yeah,
because a lot of business is business as usual. Is trying to manage that you don't have gaps in your talent pipeline, that demand is usually relatively stable. I I mean, if the Bank of England starts trying to take into account global forces, I don't, the with we have large amounts of debt as a hangover from COVID in these crises, but I don't think that there's anything sort of particularly scary on the horizon. I think the big question is around politics. So it's likely that there'll be a general election soon.
yes,
Labour will
right.
win, and they might take the country in a slightly different direction. They might be eyeing up some of the America's IRA policy, spending a lot more public money and green jobs and that sort of thing. So that could be a trend to look out for. Um, but again, are these things you can react to in advance? I would argue that if we look at something like GDP and this fall through the floor,
Yeah,
now could you have made your business robust enough to deal with that? I don't think so. I don't think anyone could have seen that coming, and any resources that you devoted to that would have come at the expense of doing the business as usual thing. Particularly as there was sort of a massive public bailout anyway, because this was too big a risk for a business to take on. And yeah, I think the best you can do, I think my advice is to actually try to get this report once every 3 months and have a
yeah,
look at the main charts and think about, okay, growth's about zero, unemployment's not going to go up too much, and inflation's going to sort itself out soon. And between those three, they will give you an idea of how things are coming. What's quite interesting is that a lot of the stuff that I presented today, I think, used to be really niche. It used to be quite difficult to understand and quite difficult to get hold of. But in the last, I'd say, 5 years, a lot of these organizations like the Bank of England, the ONS, they've invested very heavily in user experience and making things accessible.
yeah,
So one example would be the labour market statistics that came out on Tuesday. They used to be one big dense report. Now
right.
they've broken it up into about 5 or 6 separate articles. So one article will just be vacancies, and it will talk about vacancies. It'll have a couple of charts, a chart on
Yeah,
industry. One article is just on pay, and it will talk about public sector, private sector, real pay. and so it's all become a lot more accessible, not just for people who want to access the raw data, but journalists have got a bit better at analyzing it and telling the story. So I think it is, with a lot of the big jobs now, it's more important to sort of have your strategic hat on. And I think
Yes.
what's great about these stats is that they put that strategic hat within reach of people who in the past would have been like, no, I don't have an extra 2 days a week to hunt through a spreadsheet and make a chart. It's kind of it's more there on a plate. It's much more easily digestible.
Yes.
Um, so yeah, that would be my best advice. This stuff shouldn't. I try and make it so it's not seen as sort of scary and inaccessible stuff. But part of the reason I'm able to do that is because there's an infrastructure around it that's made it a little bit easier. Um,
Yeah. Wow.
so I hope that's
You've
how it came
certainly,
across.
no, absolutely. You've certainly brought it to life. And a lot of our members are interested in the wider economy beyond their world of early talent. It's very, very important, and being able to get the information that they need in a digestible form is very, very useful. So we do appreciate you sharing your insights today. I mean, there's some good news. You said we've avoided a recession. Fantastic. We can ignore all those headlines. Um, Graduates don't jump around jobs. Common misconception is that graduates don't go the distance. But like you said, it hasn't changed since the 1950s. That's interesting. And also, demand is hot. So lots of people are recruiting, but that talent pool is quite hard to attract and recruit. So the war for talent is still out there. But lots of positives to take from this, and we've gone through so many questions, and appreciate your time today, John. Um, I'm just going to quickly wrap up. So this is being recorded. So if you had to duck out, or you want to share it, or have another look, by all means do so. This will be on our GRN YouTube in the next couple of days. We do run several events, so many of you come along to our Fresh Insights events, which we have 3 a year. We also have 3 great debates where we focus on one subject and we argue that the pros and cons of a particular issue. And we also have our Leaders Lunch, which is coming up in July. So the invites for that will go out very, very soon, kindly hosted by one of our members, BDO, in July. So the Great Debate event is on the 5th of July, 1 till 2 p.m. And this is with Adam Hawkins from LinkedIn. I've been along to a few of his events now. His insights are very, very interesting. I don't know if you've come across Adam, John, but yeah, very, very interesting from his point of view with all the data they've got access to. It's very, very interesting. So we're going to be talking about the future of work and looking at the pros and cons and all the issues around that. So you're welcome to come along to the Great Debate webinar on the 5th of July, and there's the QR code for the booking page. Okay, thank you everyone for coming along. It's been a pleasure as always. Delighted to have John come along again. We do appreciate your time and your efforts to share your insights. Enjoy the rest of your day. Class dismissed. Thank you very much.